Hi, everyone. This is the new episode of this podcast, and today my guest is Peter Alexeyevich. He's my friend who currently lives in Kyiv. So, Peter, why don't you take it from here and share your story?
Hey Danny, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. What about you?
I'm well, thanks. Although it's a good day here in Kyiv because the power is on. And as you are probably aware, we lost the major uh, thermal power generating facility for Kyiv, and we've been suffering these rolling blackouts since, which is tough on everybody. Um, for me, who I am, I'm an American. I went broke twice before I turned 30. So I had an entrepreneurial background. And I finally broke down and I went to work for somebody else at the age of 30. I was at the Microsoft Corporation for a number of years. I served as the IT pro evangelist for the Mid Atlantic region and was in the technology space for about 27 years. And I came to Kyiv because I think that what's happening in Ukraine right now is the most important thing that's happening on the planet, period, full stop. And I wanted to try to be helpful. And so I spend all of my time, or the vast majority of my time, trying to communicate to my fellow Americans the importance of the continued defense of Ukraine.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. This is definitely helpful. What I want to do today is since I have a couple of probably a dozen of Americans listening to this specific episode today. Um, I have friends from all over like the political spectrum in America. So I think it'd be super helpful for this message that we are trying to communicate to the world is if I will be like a devil's advocate and try to challenge you with like ideas that some people might have about Ukraine and why America should not continue the funding and why America should not be involved with the war. And you'll just make an argument why this is not true and we can go from there. So what do you think?
Sure.
Okay, so as you said, you're now in Kiev. Obviously, you support Ukraine and the ongoing effort to defeat Russia there. Um, so, what would you say to people who say, "Hey, this is just a proxy war that America is fighting with Russia, and America should not be involved with this because this is just another thing that just costs lives and doesn't bring any positive outcome to America or to the world." So, what do you think about that?
I mean, the first thing is that anybody that says that doesn't understand the definition of a proxy war. A proxy war is when you get somebody else to do your fighting for you. The Ukrainians didn't instigate this war. The United States didn't instigate this war. The Kremlin poured 250,000 troops over the border in an attempt to erase from history an entire people, culture, and language. Now, it's not our war, to be clear. But under the Budapest Memoranda, we have certain responsibilities to support Ukraine at this critical inflection point in history. And if we are going to keep our word, as we do, and the Russians have demonstratively not done, then I don't think that there's any choice but for the United States to support the defense of Ukraine. We're not supporting a war against Russia. We're not supporting the invasion of Russia. We're not supporting anything that has to do with defeating Russia. We are supporting the defense of Ukraine against an illegal aggressor that attacked this country without UN sanction, without a coalition. I mean, the other side always talks about Iraq and Afghanistan and that bullshit. I would remind everybody that Iraq and Afghanistan were coalitions with UN sanctions and that Russia was part of both of those coalitions. So to talk about those as American wars of aggression is nonsense of the first order, as is talking about Ukraine as a proxy war.
Yeah, that's fair. So another point that I hear some people in the US are bringing is okay, like this is an unjustified invasion of Ukraine, and it it makes sense to support it, but it doesn't seem like America and the free world have the resources necessary to have a victory in this war. So people make an argument that it makes sense to try to negotiate at this point while Ukraine still has some kind of a stronghold, even though, like, unfortunately, Russia is advancing in the east. So, do you think there is a chance, an opportunity for the U.S. and the West to supply Ukraine with the necessary weapons to win?
So I feel like there's two questions there. There's first the question about, does the West have the capability to supply the weapons to Ukraine that it needs to defend itself? And then the other question seems to be around, is it time to talk? And let's separate those two clearly. And let's start with the question of weapons. I mean, so far, if I'm not mistaken, all that we have sent to Ukraine is the equivalent of about 5% of 2 years worth of the defense budget. 5%, Danny. 5%. You can't tell me that we can't afford it. Not when you look at the benefits. I mean, the depletion of Soviet stockpiles of weapons in Russia, the demilitarization of Russia for 5% of 2 years' budget, you got to be kidding me. That's the best money the United States has ever spent. And not only that, when you look at the economic impact on the United States of spending that money, because what we've sent is, with all due respect, I know it's been very helpful and everybody here is very appreciative. But really, man, we mostly just been cleaning out the garage. Those ATACMs, 1,600 of them just expired. It would have cost the United States military tens of millions of dollars to decommission them, right? Take them apart safely, put them away for forever. Instead, they're going to good use for an emergent democracy to defend itself from an aggressive authoritarian state. That's what they were built for. When Reagan paid for them in 86. So the idea that we can't afford it is nonsense of the first order. It's a question of political will. And then the question of dealing with Moscow. Moscow has wiped its ass with every treaty it signed with Ukraine. They cannot be trusted. They obviously are not going to negotiate in goodwill. You cannot negotiate with terrorists. And what the gang in the Kremlin is are a bunch of terrorists who are holding not only Ukraine hostage, not only 140 million Russians hostage, but the whole world hostage with their continued nonsensical threats of nuclear annihilation for everybody else, as if this were reasonable or rational things to say. They are not, and we shouldn't listen, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but for some reason, I don't know why. Maybe you have some ideas. We're in this situation where, after over 2 years of war, um, the West has not sent as much weaponry and whatever they need to send to win this war. So we're in this situation where we have limited supply of weaponry, and the war just drags on, and it has an enormous negative impact on people of Ukraine, on the country, on economy, and people. Soldiers are obviously dying and getting wounded. So this is not a good state to be in. And one solution is to supply the weapons to Ukraine to finish the war, to make Russia um, just sign some kind of a peace treaty where Ukraine gets all the territories back and things like that. So why does the West not involved in that? Why are they like involved in this limited supply of weaponry and this just dragged on war which doesn't seem to go anywhere?
It, Well, I wouldn't say that it doesn't seem to go anywhere. But that aside, to answer your questions as best I can, because of course I'm not in the heads of these politicians, I don't really know. But from what I can glean, now, Danny, just think about this with me. I mean, I remember when the troops were massed on the border and it became clear that Russia was coming in, in February of 2022. I remember watching the news and I remember thinking to myself, well, that's a shame. That's a shame because the Russians are going to be in Kyiv in 3 days and it's going to be over. And, Biden offered Zelensky a ride and he famously turned it down. I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. There is this bias in the establishment diplomatic corps of the United States that sees Russia as the biggest threat in the room, the 800-pound bear that's in the corner that's ready to maul everybody. There is a mixture of fear and respect and this lie that we tell ourselves that we can deal with those people, that we're going to have to deal with the Russians, that they're a power to be reckoned with in the world. And it turns out that none of that is true, that just none of that is true. And it's only Ukrainian ingenuity and resolve that made it possible for the war to continue, right? The sacrifice of the Ukrainians that are doing all the bleeding and dying right now is what has kept this war alive and kept the wolf at the door. Think about what the West did in the beginning. Sent helmets, flak jackets, tourniquets, gas masks, that kind of thing. It took us a year to agree to send a handful of tanks. It's taken 2 years, 2 full years now, to get the hope of some F-16 fighters. 2 years to get long-range unitary warhead ATACMS. 2 years to get permission to use those weapons across the border on targets inside of Russia. And so I think part of the frustration that you feel, that we all feel, is fed by this misapprehension, this over exaggeration of what Russia is, and a fear, there is a legitimate fear, of the 6,000 nuclear warheads that the Russians have in stock. And so you don't want to destabilize a country that covers 11 time zones, is responsible for 4% of the world GDP, about 9% of world oil production. You don't want to jeopardize the world economy either by destroying that fragile thing. And increasingly, what I think we see is that Russia is fragile, and it's going to wreck itself. I think that we're at a point of no return. I don't believe that Russia can survive this conflict. Right? It shouldn't be us being worried about the Russians. The Russians should be far more worried about us. They're literally bursting at the seams. And I don't believe that there will be a Russian Federation when this war is over. It's Russia that will be destroyed, not Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Well, but still, the current administration in the White House, Biden, and of course Trump as well, they don't. Their argument seems to be very simple. We don't want to escalate the war too much because it might become a World War III. China might get involved, Iran, and you don't want to send American troops into Europe to fight. So, as far as I understand, what's happening is they're trying to limit any assistance, like first with HIMARS, then with tanks, fly jets, now striking deep into Russia's territory. Do you think this is a fair approach to dealing with Russia? Because since they're terrorists, they might just decide to launch a nuclear bomb to Europe and America at one day because they're so pissed. So, what's your take on this?
So two things. First of all, I want to say On the subject of the Biden administration, I was very impressed and moved when Biden gave what I thought was a very sincere apology to President Zelensky in Paris at the D Day commemoration ceremonies for how long things have taken. And he acknowledged that the far right obstructionist party in the United States had held things up for a long time, but that they had finally been won over and everybody was on the same page now. And the reality is that's life in a democracy. It's a messy business, but it is far better than having a world where some dictator just in his incompetence can drag the entire society down a path of self-destruction, as we are seeing the Kremlin gremlins do right now to Russia. So there's that part of it. And then the other piece is, of course, it. I don't buy into that thinking of theirs, that fear of escalation. What's going to happen is if we don't stop Russia here, that's when we get World War III. That's when we get American boots on the ground in Europe again. If we want to avoid that, this has to be the line in the sand. And I'll tell you something, Danny, you can see it already. Our prevarications around this, our failure to support Ukraine the way that we should, has emboldened the mullahs in Iran to launch missiles at Israel for the first time ever in history. We've seen the North Korean regime now attacking South Korea with balloons full of garbage and excrement, as well as a cross-border incursion by North Korean troops just this week. They came across the border without guns. They had tools, farm implements in their hands. It's unclear why. The South Koreans almost fired on them. We almost went from balloons to bullets in 2 minutes. And do you think that the Kim regime in North Korea and the mullahs in Iran would be so emboldened to take these kinds of actions if it weren't for the way that they see us prevaricating around Ukraine? So no, I don't think that it's reasonable. I think that it's political, but I'm not a politician, and I don't know how you navigate those corridors of power. To me, there is only one answer, and the answer is to trust Ukraine and give Ukraine what it needs and stop micromanaging this conflict with this bullshit about, oh, don't give the Azov brigade anything. Oh, don't fire those weapons into Russian territory. Oh, don't. Give me a fucking break. Every single red line that the Kremlin has laid down, we have crossed, and there has been no escalation. Why? Because the Kremlin has a sense of its own self-preservation, and they know damn well what will happen if they launch a nuclear device. So if they even work. The strategic nuclear stockpile, according to all analysts, looks like it's in pretty good shape, but the tactical stockpile, they're as likely to irradiate Minsk or Moscow as they are to hit Kyiv. To me, that's not a fear. I wouldn't be in Kyiv if I thought it was.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. I still hear all of those voices that say, hey, like, as you said, you don't buy in this escalation agenda, but it seems like, well, to me, maybe I'm not right, but it seems like even the current administration does buy into that. Even now, they don't. They said you can use ATACMS in Kharkiv direction, but you can't use it anywhere else. So they still want to have these kinds of limitations.
Not across the border. ATACMS are off the list of cross-border weapons.
Well, yeah. Well, that just even proves my point even further. That they are still afraid of the escalation. And well, I don't know history that well, but from what I understand, like looking back at say World War I, that war broke out with like a random killing of some guy
Archduke.
in Southern Europe. So it was kind of random from what I understand, and I think the fear is if you do something like try to take Ukraine in a couple of days by bombing everything there, or try to get out of their try to strike their nuclear radars or something, or whatever needs to be done to get Russia out of Ukraine, might spark something larger and potentially, say, strikes from Cuba to the mainland United States, which would be like crazy. So what do you think about this argument?
You know what I think, Danny? I think that it's like all the arguments against helping Ukraine. It is an argument based on fear. And fear is really the weapon that the Kremlin wields most effectively against us. They keep rattling the nuclear saber because they know it scares people. We have to look them in the eye and tell them, okay, go ahead. You want to keep talking this bullshit? Launch a nuke. Please, for the love of God, either shut up or launch a nuke. Because you know what? We have 5,000 nukes in the United States, and we know ours all work because we spend 5 times as much money on maintenance of them as you do on your stockpile. So you can't tell me that your stockpile of weapons is in the same shape that ours is in. Oh, no, 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 no. Just what we see on the battlefield, the efficacy of American weapons versus Soviet and Russian weapons. There's no comparison. The Ukrainians are kicking the Russians' asses with 40-year-old American technology against their latest and greatest. And now we've just seen an S-500 missile system deployed in Crimea, the first ever deployment of an S-500 missile system. I give it a week in the field, a week to 10 days, and Ukraine will have it in pieces. $2.5 billion worth of the latest and greatest Russian hardware. It won't stand a chance against a bunch of Ukrainians with ATACMs.
Another point, which is, I don't think people use this argument too much, but it's still interesting to explore it with you. Let's say in the US, after the elections, Trump is getting elected, and obviously he's not the biggest supporter of the war in Ukraine. And let's say,
Danny, let me stop you right there. Donald Trump is not getting elected. Donald Trump can't even get Republicans to vote for him. In the primaries in Indiana, 155,000, if I'm not mistaken, well, let's call it 15%. Let's call it 15%. 15% of Republicans voted for somebody who dropped out of the race 2 months ago. Uh, Independents are fleeing Donald Trump. He's a convicted felon now. 52% of the American public believes that that disqualifies you from being a president. I don't even know that he's going to be the nominee on the ballot come November. That process is not complete. So, simply put, there is no chance that Donald Trump is going to be president. And I will bet real money on that. I'll bet American money on that. Which, as of today, under the new sanctions package, the Russian Central Exchange can no longer use, which is very exciting to me. The sanctions package prohibits the Russian stock market from doing any currency exchanges in euros or in dollars. Which, if the importance of that is, I mean, it's so important to the economy, and it's going to help wreck the Russian economy. There's no two ways about it. So I'd be more interested in talking about what the Biden administration is doing to stop Russia in this new sanctions package than I would be some hypothetical about some second-rate con artist, snake oil salesman who's going to get himself back into the White House again, because he's not. He only got there the first time because of Russian help. Make no mistake. The guy is a piece of shit Russian asset, and he's about to die in jail.
yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Anybody still listening to that idiot is a fool. Is a fool. They're fools.
Okay. Well, before we end, do you have a final message let's say, to Americans or people who live in the West, maybe those who don't fully support war in Ukraine or starting to lose that idea of supporting the war, what would you say them to change their minds?
Two things. First, we're not supporting a war. We're supporting the right of a free people to defend themselves against an aggressor. That's a very different thing. Nobody wants war. War is bad for business. Every American capitalist knows that. It's not how you make money. Um, I know there people are going to say, "Oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. The defense industry is making billions." The defense industry is only 4% of the U.S. economy. It's a very small number of people that are making money in this. The way you grow wealth is for the vast majority of your population is through peace. So nobody is interested in war. But if we're to have the courage of our convictions, we must support the right of a democratic and free people to fight for their own freedom. And that's the very first thing off the bat. The second thing is, I really want to encourage Americans to think about, and people in the West, to think about a consistency of being consistent in your views on the world. And here's the thing, the Russians have made a talking point out of Gaza. Either you support Israel or you support Gaza. And if you don't support Gaza, if you don't support the Palestinians, then somehow they've tied it into being anti-Ukraine. Like you can't support the liberation of Ukraine and the liberation of the Palestinians. This is a false dichotomy of the worst sort. I can't even figure out how people are falling for this. You can support the right of Israel to exist. You can support the right of a Palestinian state. You can support a two-state solution there. And you can support the right of the people of Ukraine to defend themselves. There is a false narrative around this whole Palestinian conflict that is being conflated with Ukraine in a negative way that I really want people to think about and to understand that if you're being consistent and you're against the genocide in Ukraine, then you should be against the genocide in Palestine, and you should support a two-state solution there, as well as the right of Israel to exist and Ukraine to exist. I don't see how those things are incompatible. On the contrary, I think that that's a cohesive, coherent view of the world, not one in which it's one or the other. The world in which it's one or the other is a false world that has been created by a Russian disinformation narrative. And it's been very effective. I can't believe the way that people have embraced this nonsense.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And well, first of all, thank you for coming to Ukraine, for spending so much time there, suffering with Ukrainians, and spreading the word about the war and what's happening in Ukraine. This is like this takes a lot of courage to do so, leaving America to be in Ukraine during the war. So I respect that a lot, and I appreciate your presence today, and that you shared your views on that, and at least try to change people's minds about Russia's war in Ukraine.
Thanks, Danny. Great talking to you as always.
Yeah, thank you.